feel free to start whenever.
Hey, okay. So, yeah, this is quite a different vibe for me. So I'm submitting 3 short submissions to a conference called Anticipation 2022. And that's interesting because there is no formal conference proceedings for Anticipation 2022, which I would be used to in a computing context. So I think it's maybe more typical of the humanities to have a conference where you go talk about a paper and then you write the paper later and submit it to a journal. But I have 2 papers and a workshop. So I'm presenting them to you today as if they were kind of part of a cohesive whole, which I think they are, but they weren't written that way. So I should first introduce my collaborators. The first group of people are people I worked with through the Pedagogy project, which is a project about peer-produced peer learning. So peer learning is something you might find in an education context where teachers would say, hey, students, you should learn together and work in groups. But peer-produced peer learning is a bit more radical, where the people who are learning are also trying to co-create the learning environment. So you could say, imagine the teachers learning amongst themselves and structuring their own educational program could be an example that's kind of halfway into the normal education world. Abby is someone who works in the medical school at the University of West of England. She's a psychologist, behavioral psychologist by training, and her work is mainly about chronic pain. But actually, I saw a talk by her, which is very innovative, talking about how people live in cities. And I approached her after thinking about that and thinking in connection with a British Academy proposal, which is still out being considered, could we work together about urban environments, which has become a really great joint interest. So this is our first paper together. And then these 2 are people I met at Emacs Conf, which is a conference about the Emacs editor. And we've since been working together for over a year about Emacs. And by the way, you see Emacs right now. So, so there's a lot of collaborators many of them who are not academics. A few of them are, but it's quite an interesting crowd. And what we're working on in a very high level in the Pedagogy project, we have been looking at design patterns. So it's too bad Ari isn't here because he loves design patterns. What this first paper was about is using design patterns in the context of futures. It's also too bad that Paul isn't here because futures.
I am.
Oh, Paul is? Well, then
I just muted because my bandwidth is terrible.
Oh, well, then it's excellent that Paul is here and muted. Thanks. So futures are something that really is mainly linked with the business world, I think. And so people will go around trying to anticipate what will happen in the future of their business, or even in the sector or the level of a nation or something. So I've been reading a book talking about apartheid in South Africa, and they were talking about how, you know, when it was clear that was going to come to an end, a bunch of people who were not specifically the folks in power convened to talk about how they wanted to change it. None of them had exactly the same idea, but they came up with a bunch of scenarios about how the future could evolve. And those scenarios then, at least according to the book, helped influence the way everyone thought about things in the years that followed. So in this paper, we talked about using some design patterns, which isn't the typical mix, but design patterns typically have a context, a problem, and a solution. So in this case, the problem is you want to develop some kind of culture based on shared learning, but you don't know what to expect about the future. So you're developing your culture and you want to think about the future, but no one really can tell you what's happening. So the proposal here is to actually use a bunch of different design patterns, say for talking about projects or roles or future scenarios. And all these dots means that those aren't that developed yet, but there's an example here. I'll show my example of play to anticipate the future. So in this case, you're engaging with some friends, colleagues, or acquaintances. Maybe we could do this at our institute. And you want to explore possible futures, say, for artificial intelligence. But you can't because time travel doesn't exist. So what you could do is play a game that will let you experience a plausible future scenario together. Here's a quite serious example of a bipartisan group playing a scenario planning game to anticipate the aftermath of a contested U.S. election. And they were surprised by what they came up with in that. Another kind of commonplace example might be the game Pandemic, where people could have anticipated what it would be like to be working together to solve pandemic. So these are just 2 design patterns, and those are the examples from this first paper, which is only 3 pages. But the idea is that we could build a whole catalog of techniques for thinking about the future. And in fact, I'll just skip ahead and mention that we come back to that in the workshop, but I won't talk about that right now. The other paper with Abby is more theoretical, I would say, and in a sense quite exciting. In fact, we decided to write it as if the paper itself was a pattern. So the problem in this case is, how do you ascertain the ethical validity of interventions? So one of Abby's examples is access to green space is known to increase health, but how much green space and how close does it have to be? And does it work across all health conditions or just some of them? And are there some ways in which accessing the green space works better or not? So, someone says, oh, well, green space is good for your health. How do you know? And I think this is a topic that's really interesting for the Institute for Ethical AI. Certainly, if you just look at the ethics part, how do you know it's a good idea? Someone says to you, oh, you should take this medicine or take this type of therapy. But then you look at the details and you realize, oh, well, not everyone is actually going to be helped by that medicine or by that therapy. There's something called a number needed to treat, which means that, say, 3 out of 4 people treated by this method might actually not be helped by it. They won't be harmed, but is it a good use of their time? So what we talked about in this paper is addressing this problem through something called the active inference framework, which is an idea from life sciences that claims to be a kind of unified theory of how life works. And as such, it's quite abstract. It's quite theoretical. But there's quite some common ground between active inference and design patterns, which Abby and I were both very excited by. So they're both effectively driven by conflict. So in the design pattern world, you say, well, there's a conflict, and I showed you some. You have this condition, but you want that, but you can't have that. And so how do you address that? Maybe through some type of compromise. And design helps overcome that. Best example might be a ramp. You want to get up, but you can only go straight. So you get a ramp, and so you don't go quite straight, but you go up and straight, and you get there. So in active inference, conflict plays an even more fundamental role. And they basically say every action in our life is going to do one of 2 things. It's either updating our model of the world, so we're learning about the world and saying, oh, I see, it doesn't work the way I thought. Well, I'll learn something, so I won't be surprised by that occurrence next time. Or even more fundamentally, and this is quite a strange thing, you just change reality to match your model. You think, okay, I wanted a cup of coffee. Well, I'll go make myself a cup of coffee, and then I'll go drink a cup of coffee. So they're sort of saying that all action is driven by a conflict between your model and reality. And so this is quite a powerful concept in this theory. And again, they both have a notion of hierarchy. So design patterns typically live in something called a pattern language, where you go up to a more abstract or bigger level and then come back down in a cascade. So if you want to design a city or a health intervention, you'd start at the bigger scales, like, at the city, you'd start with the region, and with the health intervention, you might start with something like the person's, habits rather than the minute details of some specific condition, for example. So they're arranged hierarchically, and in AIF, you go up the hierarchy, and it will provide some moderation for the content at the lower level. And it will say, yeah, here's where I'm recognizing a problem, a discrepancy at this lower level. And they both have a notion of embodiment as well. So design patterns basically work through fitting the context sorry, let me read what it says here. The conflict at first needs to be sensed, the solution needs to be thought through, and the implementation fitted to the context as it put into action. That is much better put. And in fact, this is citing my own work, so I should probably read it pretty carefully. And then similarly, this active inference basically describes any system with a boundary and partitions the system into their sensory, internal, and active states, which is much like with these the way that the design pattern theory seems to work. They're just theories of action, but that action is embodied. And of course, for the people at this conference, we wanted to talk about how they're all anticipatory. So we upgraded the design patterns with some kind of next step, and I skipped past that quickly. I'll show another one. In active inference, there again, it's quite anticipatory. The idea in these models is the models are generative, and they generate potential actions, which are then selected. So the whole model is kind of anticipating the world in a generative way and selecting those actions which best match the model at the appropriate level. And lastly, they both seem to have some kind of attribute of health or wholeness, that if you put together a bunch of patterns, not always just one pattern, but a bunch of them, you get something that's a healthy whole system. At least that was the idea. And in active inference, the way that shows up is that organisms are supposed to be increasingly good models of their niche. So I'll just say there's quite a lot of overlap between these things, and that's spelled out here. The solution that we proposed is then to take a bunch of patterns, and we had some of these in pedagogy, which might be a good source, and they look like this. So you'd say, here's a context in which people have shared interests, but they can't continually work together. So one solution is just that they should meet weekly or bi-weekly, and we're quite familiar with that. And here that is spelled out again in a bit more detail with some of those links towards the active inference system. I won't read all of that, but the next step would be to instrument your heartbeat. So you'd say, well, are we having enough meetings? Are we having too many meetings? Do the meetings actually help? And stuff like that. So you could imagine a kind of rating of the meeting. Was this a good meeting? And you could start to evaluate whether they're actually contributing to the purpose that they apparently serve. So it says 10:15, but I started a little after. So I'll just go on to say in the workshop, we've proposed, they've given us 90 minutes. So in 80 minutes plus 10 minutes for break, we've proposed to get people started envisioning, exploring, and enacting the future using design patterns. So inviting them, and furthermore, since this is anticipation, we want to get them to go meta and invite them to envision new methods for example, envisioning the future. So how do they envision the future? And then how will they be doing that in say 5 years or 10 years? Will we have new ways of thinking about the future? So this is a quite exciting, I think, reflective setting to put the participants in. And I'll just mention that this is an adaptation of a pilot that we piloted at the Brooks Creative Industry Festival, and as well at the Connected Learning Summit and Pattern Languages of Programs. And in that setting, it was a bit complicated. We had a bunch of scenarios and roles and actions and stuff that we'd taken from other people's work and just made a mashup, which is kind of a pedagogy method to make a mashup. In this case, all of that's going to be considerably simplified by rewriting all of that into a pattern catalog and then getting the participants to collaborate on expanding that. So anyway, so yeah, that's the end of my time. There are, again, two interesting papers talking about collaborative anticipation and then bringing that into the level of theory with potential links as well to artificial agents. I didn't mention, but could also just briefly mention that Abby has a bit of money, and she's paying some folks in Montreal who are developing an agent-based model of population health. And what we want to do is bring some design patterns into that simulation to give a way for the agents to share knowledge, much like I talked about people doing here. So that's the end of that presentation. Let me stop. I don't know if there's time for any Q&A. Oh, Ari is here. Hi, Ari. I was glad you made it because I was talking about design patterns, so I thought.
Yeah, my bandwidth's been all over the place. Really, really interesting. I've got some interesting questions about what we do. How's the population health stuff going?
I would say quite well. Yeah, it's been really interesting working with Abby. So she has a source of data, and they want to basically build a plausible agent model that's just a simulation, and they also want to let those agents loose, basically on the data. And I'm not quite sure how that will work, but to see if they replicate health outcomes across the population.
Touch base on that in person in the next few weeks, because I have that NHS project sort of started, and we are we are rolling this technology out to a group of GP practices. So we're seeing a lot of data.
Yeah.
We'll be seeing about 100, having a capacity to do about 100,000 documents in sort of like the